Okay, so in the last video, you saw that .inner.html was a bad idea. Let's see how we can do this rendering without it. So we have this list of items, and this time we are going to render all the items. So let's iterate over the list. So const item of items. And now what we want to do is to create a DOM element for an item. We already have the item as a JavaScript object. Let's create the item DOM. And there is a method on document called createElement. And we can say what kind of element we want to create. In this case, we want to create a list item. And that's a DOM element. And now we can do things with this DOM element. Right off the bat, when we create it, it's not on the page. We cannot really see it. So the first thing we want to do is to add it to the items DOM, to the list that we see on the page. So we can say items DOM dot append item DOM. Now, if we only do this, every 200 milliseconds render is called, and we are appending all the to-do items to the list. So the list is going to grow very fast. So as a workaround, as a temporary workaround, let's say items DOM inner HTML equals empty. So in the beginning of every render, we are wiping out all the data, and then we are rendering the elements. Okay, so we are now rendering list items, but we are not saying what the description of the item is. So we need to collect that from the item object. And we can say things like item DOM dot inner text equals item description. Notice that inner text is not inner HTML. The difference is that anything you say to inner HTML will be rendered as HTML. But inner text will treat whatever you are assigning as text, as plain text. So we no longer have that problem of rendering user data as HTML. Let's see how this works in the browser. So here I refresh the page, and now I can see that to do items as plain text. So we solved part of the problem. There is still a lot more we need to do. For instance, we need to have that checkbox on the side of the list item that when the user clicks that checkbox, we are deleting the item. And the way we do that is similar to how we create a to-do item here, how we create the item DOM. We can say const checkbox is document create element, and this time the little checkbox is an input in HTML. And again, when I am rendering this guy, when I'm creating this guy, I'm not necessarily rendering it. So I still have to say that I want this checkbox to appear in the item DOM. So I can say things like item DOM append child of checkbox. And I'm rendering the checkbox in the item and the item in the list. We also have to say that the checkbox is not any kind of input. By default, it would be a text area. We want it in particular to be a checkbox. So we can set attribute of type checkbox. If you are familiar with JavaScript, if you're familiar with HTML, then you are going to recognize this whole construct, this whole thing we are writing as something that looks like a list item that contains the description. For instance, hi, hello, this is the description. And also here, there would be an input of type checkbox. This is the HTML that is generated by this whole code. Now let's see this in the browser. Yeah, so we are now seeing some checkboxes. They might be rendered on the wrong side and everything, but they are there. And we can do a similar thing to attach some behavior to the checkbox. So if I say checkbox dot add event listener change, and this event is triggered by the click. So when the checkbox is checked, this event triggers, and we can say that, for instance, we want to remove item with this item. So remove item is a function that we have already written here. It's just going to the server and doing the actual deletion. But yeah, so we are just binding the change event to this function that we already have. Again, notice how item here is in the closure. So we are defining a function, and we can access item, which is non-local to this function. It's not an argument to this function, but it is available here, so we can use the item in here. It's the same business we saw 2 videos ago when we were looking at var. In fact, if we had used var here, then we would need to use that trick of the immediately invoked function expression, but because we are using const, then this thing just works. Now, similar to how we are doing this, we can also do much more. We can do a lot more in terms of DOM manipulation. We can remove items instead of just creating them and adding them to the DOM. And we can inspect items. And if you go to the source code for the full to-do app and you read it, you're going to see that I'm doing a lot more. And that's because I don't want to wipe out the whole data and then recreate it every time. And that's because I want users to be able to interact with this. So I want users to be able to click on it and start typing, or to check something and see the item go away. So I don't want to re-render the whole list every time. I want to just, if there is a new item, I'm going to render it. If some item changed, I want to render it. I also want to pay attention not to try to update an item that the user is currently editing, because that would mess up with the editing experience. So I take a lot more care about these kinds of things. And I suggest you go over the full code for the to-do app, and you look over those elements and that part of the DOM manipulation. I'm not going to go over everything here in this video, but just know how the thing works and what is the intent. The intent is that we want to render selectively. We want to see the differences between items that is coming from the server and items DOM, the elements that are in the items DOM, and only want to render them selectively. But now that you know all the DOM manipulation things, like create element and how to add elements to the DOM and so forth, reading that code should be relatively straightforward. And there is still a lot more to talk about DOM manipulation. There are web components that bring this idea of templates, and that helps clean up this kind of code. You can write this, the HTML that I showed you before, more or less like you would want to read it, and it would not be subject to this sort of problems of trying to render user data as HTML. So there is this idea of web components that you can explore in your group projects. There is also there are some frameworks dedicated to rendering these kinds of things. For instance, React is a popular one, and it does that diff that I was talking about, the difference between the items you see from the server and the items that you see in the DOM. It does all that automatically, so it will help clean a lot of the to-do app code. And you can do a lot more with DOM manipulation. But that's it for DOM for now. On the next video, we are going to switch gears and talk about WebSockets. A better way to do this pulling, because pulling the server every 200 milliseconds is a bad idea. So let's see how to improve on that.